Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of history's most spectacular examples of how Mother Nature can absolutely demolish human civilization without breaking a sweat. We're talking about the Spanish flu of 1918, the pandemic that looked at World War I and said, "Hold my petri dish. I'll show you real carnage." So go ahead and hit that like button if you're ready for some existential dread with your evening entertainment. And let me know in the comments what decade you think humanity will inevitably forget these lessons again. Now settle in, maybe grab some hand sanitizer for the full immersive experience, and let's explore how a microscopic enemy managed to kill more people in 18 months than the so-called war to end all wars killed in 4 years. So, you think modern medicine would have saved you in 1918? Charming. Really, like thinking your iPhone would stop a medieval trebuchet. Let's see how an invisible killer turned the entire planet into its personal hunting ground and left civilization wondering if maybe, just maybe, humans weren't quite as clever as they thought they were. Picture this: the year is 1918, and humanity thinks it's finally getting somewhere. We've got automobiles that don't explode quite as often, electric lights that only occasionally electrocute people, and a world war that everyone swore would end all wars because surely, we couldn't get any more creative with wholesale slaughter. Wrong on all counts, but especially wrong about that last part, because while everyone was busy shooting each other in trenches that smelled like gangrene and broken dreams, something far more efficient was preparing to show up fashionably late to the apocalypse party. Enter H1N1, though nobody called it that yet. They called it the Spanish flu, which was about as accurate as calling the Pacific Ocean slightly damp. Spain didn't create this monster any more than France created French fries, but Spain was one of the few countries not busy censoring their newspapers to maintain wartime morale. So they actually reported on the mysterious illness that was turning healthy young adults into corpses faster than you could say a co. The rest of the world was too busy pretending their soldiers weren't dropping like flies to admit they had a problem that wasn't solved by bayonets and patriotic speeches. But let's back up to the beginning, shall we? Because every good apocalypse needs an origin story, and this one starts in the most American way possible. On a farm in Kansas, where wide open spaces met poor sanitation, and the American dream of manifest destiny was about to meet its microscopic match. It was March 1918, and Albert Gitchell, a cook at Camp Funston in Kansas, woke up feeling like someone had beaten him with a sack of particularly vindictive potatoes. Fever, headache, muscle aches, the usual suspects of feeling absolutely dreadful. In any rational timeline, Albert would have stayed in bed, perhaps sipped some chicken soup, and complained to anyone who'd listen about his horrible luck. But this was not a rational timeline. This was wartime. And wartime operates on the principle that personal comfort comes somewhere after winning the war, and slightly before caring about what happens to enemy prisoners. So Albert dragged himself to the infirmary, where the military doctor took one look at him and basically said, "Yeah, you look terrible, but so does everyone else. Take an aspirin and try not to die on my paperwork." Within hours, dozens of other soldiers were showing up with the same symptoms. Within days, it was hundreds. Within weeks, Camp Funston looked like a preview of the afterlife's waiting room. The military, in its infinite wisdom, decided this was probably just regular flow, nothing to worry about. Certainly nothing that should interfere with their plans to ship thousands of young men across an ocean to shoot at other young men in muddy holes. Because what could possibly go wrong with cramming sick soldiers into transport ships for weeks at a time? It's not like diseases spread or anything. Spoiler alert thing. Diseases spread. Oh, how they spread. The transport ships became floating laboratories for viral evolution, except instead of beakers and test tubes, they had human beings packed together like sardines in conditions that would make a medieval plague pit look spacious. The soldiers called these ships coffin ships, which would have been darkly humorous if it weren't so literally accurate. Men who boarded healthy were carried off on stretchers. Men who boarded with mild symptoms were carried off under sheets. The virus, meanwhile, was having the time of its microscopic life. All those lovely human hosts, all crowded together, all breathing the same recycled air, all sharing the same delightful lack of basic hygiene that comes with maritime military transport. It was like an all You can infect Buffett, and H1N1 had worked up quite an appetite. By the time these floating Petri dishes reached Europe, the virus had learned some new tricks. This wasn't your grandfather's flu anymore. This was flu with ambition, flu with a graduate degree in human destruction, flu that looked at the Black Death and said, "Hold my beer." The first wave hit in the spring of 1918, and it was almost polite by comparison. People got sick, some died, but mostly it behaved like regular flu, targeting the very young, the very old, and the already sick. The kind of civilized plague that follows the rules and doesn't make too much of a fuss. Medical professionals looked at it and thought, well, this is unpleasant, but manageable. We've seen worse. They had not seen worse. They had no idea what worse looked like. Summer came, and the flu seemed to retreat. People congratulated themselves on weathering another seasonal illness. Governments quietly stopped tracking cases. The war effort resumed its normal rhythm of industrial-scale human wastage. Everyone agreed that the crisis was over. The virus was just getting warmed up. What happened next was like a horror movie, where the killer comes back for the sequel, except instead of a masked maniac with a knife, it was a microscopic killing machine that had spent the summer figuring out how to be more efficiently deadly. The second wave arrived in the fall of 1918, and it was everything the first wave wasn't: vicious, indiscriminate, and absolutely uninterested in following any of the traditional rules of infectious disease. This new version didn't bother with the courtesy of targeting the weak and vulnerable. This version looked at healthy 20-somethings in the prime of their lives and said, "Yeah, you'll do nicely." It was particularly fond of people between 18 and 40, which was unfortunate because those were precisely the people society needed to, keep society running. The mechanism was brutally elegant. The virus would trigger what doctors now call a cytokine storm, which sounds like something from a superhero movie, but is actually your immune system having a catastrophic overreaction to the infection. Your body, in its determination to fight off the invader, would essentially declare war on itself. The stronger your immune system, the more spectacular its self-destructive tantrum. Young, healthy people with robust immune responses were basically signing their own death warrants. People would wake up feeling fine, develop symptoms by lunch, and be dead by dinner. There were cases of individuals who got sick on their morning commute and never made it home. The virus was so aggressive that some victims developed heliotrope cyanosis, a condition where lack of oxygen turned their skin a dark purple-blue color. They called it the Purple Death, because apparently regular death wasn't dramatic enough. In Philadelphia, the city's leadership made a decision that would go down in history as one of the most spectacularly ill-timed examples of civic pride ever recorded. Despite warnings from health officials, despite reports from other cities, despite the growing pile of evidence that maybe, just maybe, large public gatherings were not the best idea during a pandemic, they decided to go ahead with a massive Liberty Loan parade to support the war effort. 200,000 people lined the streets on September 28, 1918. They cheered, they sang, they pressed together in patriotic fervor. The virus couldn't have planned a better superspreader event if it had hired a team of marketing consultants and a flash mob coordinator. Within 72 hours, every hospital bed in Philadelphia was full. Within a week, they were stacking bodies in cold storage warehouses because the morgues had run out of space. The city's entire infrastructure collapsed under the weight of simultaneous mass death. Police officers, firefighters, doctors, nurses, garbage collectors, telephone operators, everyone was either sick, dead, or taking care of someone who was sick or dead. The dead were piling up faster than the living could dispose of them. Families waited days for someone to collect their deceased relatives. Bodies were stacked in homes, in public buildings, in the streets. The city started using steam shovels to dig mass graves because they'd run out of grave diggers. The smell was so overwhelming that people who ventured outside wore masks soaked in perfume or camphor, not because they thought it would prevent infection, but because it was the only way to breathe without vomiting. And Philadelphia wasn't unique. This scene was playing out in cities across the globe with minor variations in the details, but the same fundamental theme: modern civilization. That proud achievement of human organization and technology was folding like a house of cards in a hurricane. In Boston, The telephone system collapsed because too many operators were dead. In New York, garbage piled up in the streets because there was no one to collect it. In Chicago, the police department stopped responding to all but the most serious crimes because they didn't have enough healthy officers. The social contract that held urban life together was dissolving in real time. But the cities, horrible as they were at least prepared for some level of medical crisis. They had hospitals, doctors, some semblance of public health infrastructure. Rural areas had none of these luxuries, and when the flu reached them, it was like watching a medieval plague descend on communities that had barely figured out electricity. Small farming towns that had never seen a doctor in their entire existence suddenly needed dozens of them. Villages where everyone knew everyone else found themselves digging graves for half their neighbors. The flu would sweep through these places like wildfire through dry grass, leaving behind ghost towns where the only sound was the wind rattling through abandoned buildings. Native American communities were hit with particular savagery. Centuries of isolation had left many tribes with no natural immunity to European diseases, and the Spanish flu found virgin territory among populations that had already been decimated by previous epidemics. Entire villages would be wiped out, their oral histories and cultural knowledge dying with the last speaker. It was genocide by virus, and it was happening at the speed of human breath. In Alaska, the flu reached remote Inuit communities via trade routes, carried by dog sled teams that brought death along with supplies. Villages that had survived the Arctic as worse conditions for generations found themselves facing an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't fight, and couldn't escape. Families died together in their homes, leaving behind settlements where only the dogs remained alive, howling in the endless polar night. The medical establishment, such as it was, found itself completely overwhelmed and largely useless. The germ theory of disease was still relatively new. Antibiotics wouldn't be discovered for another decade, and most treatments were based more on optimism than science. Doctors prescribed everything from aspirin to whiskey to bloodletting, with roughly equal effectiveness, which is to say none at all. Some physicians recommended fresh air and sunshine, which at least had the virtue of getting people away from other infected individuals. Others suggested various patent medicines that claimed to cure everything from consumption to moral weakness. Snake oil salesmen had a field day, peddling miracle cures to desperate families who would try anything to save their loved ones. The most common medical advice was bed rest, fluids, and hope for the best. This was essentially telling people to lie down and see if they lived or died, which wasn't much of a treatment plan, but was probably better than some of the alternatives. At least it didn't involve mercury or intentional bloodletting. Hospitals, when they could function at all, became warehouses for the dying. There weren't enough beds, so patients were laid out on mattresses in hallways, in storage rooms, wherever space could be found. There weren't enough doctors or nurses, so medical students and volunteers with no training tried to fill the gaps. There weren't enough supplies, so people made do with whatever they could find. The nursing shortage was particularly acute because nursing was one of the few medical professions that actually required close, prolonged contact with patients. Nurses were dying at horrific rates, but new ones kept volunteering because someone had to take care of the sick, even if it meant a high probability of joining them in the morgue. Many hospitals simply closed their doors when too many staff members died or fled. The ones that stayed open operated under conditions that would have been familiar to field surgeons during the Civil War, overwhelmed, undersupplied, and largely improvising their way through an impossible situation. Meanwhile, public health officials were trying to implement control measures with about as much success as you'd expect from a system that had never dealt with anything remotely like this. They closed schools, banned public gatherings, mandated mask wearing in some places, and generally tried to convince people to avoid each other as much as possible. The mask requirements were about as popular then as they would be a century later, which is to say not at all. People complained that masks were uncomfortable, ineffective, unconstitutional, and probably part of some larger conspiracy. Anti-mask leagues formed in several cities, holding rallies where people proudly gathered maskless to protest public health measures during a deadly pandemic. The irony was apparently lost on them. though probably not on the virus. Some cities implemented strict quarantine measures, posting guards at the homes of infected families and forbidding them from leaving. This worked about as well as you'd expect when the guards themselves started getting sick and dying. Other cities tried a more lenient approach, relying on people's common sense and civic responsibility to voluntarily isolate when sick. This worked about as well as you'd expect when people needed to work to eat and had no social safety net to fall back on. The war effort, meanwhile, continued with the single-minded determination of a bureaucracy that had lost touch with reality. Military officials insisted that the war must go on, that the flu was a minor inconvenience compared to the threat of German imperialism. They continued shipping sick soldiers across oceans, continued crowding healthy recruits into training camps, continued pretending that you could fight a two-front war against both human enemies and microscopic ones. The result was that military camps became breeding grounds for new, more virulent strains of the virus. Each camp was essentially running its own evolutionary laboratory, creating conditions where only the most aggressive variants would survive and spread. The military was inadvertently weaponizing the flu against their own forces, and they were doing it with characteristic military efficiency. Troop movements spread the virus faster than any natural migration pattern could have managed. A regiment that picked up the flu in Kansas could spread it to New York, then to France, then to Italy, then to the Middle East, all within a matter of weeks. The global transportation network that was supposed to be humanity's great achievement was instead serving as the circulatory system for a planetary infection. By the fall of 1918, the flu had reached every inhabited continent and most inhabited islands. It was in the trenches of France, where soldiers were dying of disease faster than enemy action could kill them. It was in the factories of Britain, where production ground to a halt as entire shifts called in sick or dead. It was in the rice paddies of Asia, where farmers collapsed in their fields and crops rotted unharvested. The virus had gone global with a speed and thoroughness that would have impressed any military strategist. It didn't respect borders, ideologies, or national allegiances. It was equally happy to kill Germans and Americans, British and French, civilians and soldiers. It was the most egalitarian force in human history, and it was using that equality to efficiently murder everyone it could reach. In India, which was still under British colonial rule, the flu combined with existing malnutrition and poverty to create conditions of almost unimaginable suffering. Entire villages were wiped out, leaving behind empty houses and untended fields. The colonial administration, such as it was, collapsed under the weight of trying to maintain order, while most of its personnel were either dead or dying. The official British response was characteristically bureaucratic. They issued regulations, filed reports, and generally tried to maintain the appearance of control while everything fell apart around them. Local communities were left to fend for themselves, which in many cases meant organized mass funeral pyres and the kind of pragmatic brutality that comes with survival-level desperation. In Africa, the flu spread along trade routes and colonial administrative networks, devastating communities that had never encountered anything like it. The disease combined with ongoing conflicts, famines, and the general chaos of colonial exploitation to create humanitarian disasters that would have made headlines if anyone had been left alive to write them. China, in the midst of its own political upheavals, saw entire provinces depopulated by the flu. The weak central government had no capacity to respond to a medical crisis of this scale, and local communities were reduced to medieval responses: quarantine the sick, burn the dead, and hope the plague passed by quickly. Australia, despite its geographic isolation, couldn't escape the pandemic. The flu arrived by ship and spread quickly through the population centres along the coast. The government implemented some of the world's strictest quarantine measures, but it was like trying to stop the ocean with a screen door. The virus found every gap, every weakness, every moment of human contact. Even remote Pacific islands, places that had been isolated from the outside world for generations, found themselves facing the Spanish flu when trading ships or military vessels made contact. These populations, with no previous exposure to influenza strains, experienced mortality rates that bordered on complete extinction. Entire island cultures disappeared in a matter of weeks. The The social fabric that held communities together was shredding under the pressure. Traditional hierarchies collapsed when the people in charge started dying as quickly as everyone else. Religious institutions, which might normally provide comfort during times of crisis, found their clergy decimated by a virus that didn't respect spiritual authority any more than it respected temporal power. Churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples became morgues when there was nowhere else to store the dead. Religious services were banned in many places, leaving people to face their mortality without the comfort of communal faith. Some interpreted the pandemic as divine punishment, others as evidence that there was no divine plan at all. Both conclusions led to the kind of existential despair that makes people question everything they thought they knew about the world. Families were torn apart not just by death, but by the practical impossibilities of caring for multiple sick members simultaneously. Parents had to choose which children to tend to when they were all dying. Children watched their parents waste away and knew they were probably next. The basic human bonds that defined civilization were being tested to their breaking point. The economic implications were staggering. Businesses closed because their workers were dead. Farms went unharvested because there was no one left to work the fields. Transportation networks collapsed because there weren't enough healthy people to operate them. The global economy, which had been chugging along despite the war, ground to a halt as the workforce simply disappeared. Stock markets crashed in some places and simply ceased to function in others. Currency became worthless in regions where there was nothing left to buy and no one left to sell it. Barter systems emerged in communities where money no longer had meaning. But even barter required having something to trade, and many people had nothing left but their own survival. The war itself began to seem almost quaint compared to the pandemic. Soldiers on both sides of the conflict found themselves fighting an enemy that didn't wear uniforms, didn't follow the rules of engagement, and couldn't be defeated by superior tactics or better equipment. Military cemeteries that had been filling with war dead suddenly had to expand to accommodate flu victims, and eventually it became difficult to tell which cause of death was claiming more lives. Some military units simply ceased to exist, not because they were defeated in battle, but because every member had succumbed to the flu. Entire regiments would be listed as combat ineffective, when what they really meant was, everyone's dead from disease. The great military machines that had been grinding up human lives found themselves running out of humans to grind. By early 1919, the second wave was finally beginning to subside, not because humanity had found an effective response, but because the virus was running out of susceptible hosts. In many communities, so many people had either died or developed immunity that there simply weren't enough viable targets left to sustain the exponential spread. But the virus wasn't finished yet. Just when people thought the worst was over, a third wave emerged in the spring of 1919. This one was less severe than the autumn catastrophe, but it was still deadly enough to crush any hope that the nightmare was ending. People who had survived the previous waves and thought they were safe found themselves facing the disease again, and some of them didn't survive the encore performance. The third wave was like a cruel joke, a final insult from a virus that had already demonstrated its complete contempt for human suffering. Communities that were just beginning to rebuild, families that were just starting to hope, individuals who were just learning to live with their losses, all of them had to face the possibility that everything could be taken away again. Some places saw fourth, and even fifth waves as the virus continued to circulate through populations that had been devastated, but not completely destroyed. Each wave was smaller than the last, but even a small wave can drown you if you're already struggling to stay afloat. Children who had been orphaned by the early waves grew up in a world where death was commonplace and security was an illusion. They learned to expect loss, to prepare for disaster, to never quite trust that good times would last. An entire generation was shaped by the trauma of watching their world fall apart before they were old enough to understand why. The psychological impact was as profound as the physical devastation. Survivors suffered from what would now be recognized as mass PTSD, though the language and understanding of mental health were primitive by today's standards. People who had watched entire families die, who had buried their own children, who had seen their communities destroyed, were expected to simply move on and rebuild their lives as if nothing had happened. Many couldn't. Suicide rates spiked in the years following the pandemic, as people who had survived the virus found themselves unable to survive the memory of what they'd experienced. Others turned to alcohol, drugs, or other forms of self-medication to numb the pain of loss and the fear that it could all happen again. The arts and literature of the 1920s reflected this trauma in oblique ways. The nihilism and hedonism of the Jazz Age wasn't just a reaction to the war. It was a response to a world that had revealed itself to be fundamentally unpredictable and dangerous. If death could come for anyone at any time, then maybe the only rational response was to embrace pleasure and meaning while you could. The lost generation of writers and artists who came of age during this period weren't just lost because of the war. They were lost because they had seen civilization itself prove to be more fragile than anyone had imagined. The comfortable assumptions of progress and human control over nature had been shattered along with everything else. Scientific and medical communities emerged from the pandemic with a new humility about the limits of their knowledge. The arrogance of early 20th century medicine, which had begun to believe it could conquer any disease, was replaced by a more sober understanding of human vulnerability. This led to advances in public health, epidemiology, and virology, but it also led to a recognition that microbes might always have the last word in humanity's relationship with the natural world. Governments learned hard lessons about emergency preparedness, though whether they retained those lessons for future crises remained to be seen. The pandemic revealed the inadequacy of existing public health infrastructure and the necessity of international cooperation in fighting global threats. It also demonstrated the political difficulty of implementing unpopular, but necessary public health measures. The Spanish flu officially ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. There was no decisive victory, no moment when humanity could declare triumph over the virus. It just gradually faded away as populations developed immunity and the most virulent strains burned themselves out. By 1920, influenza had returned to its normal pattern of seasonal infection, leaving behind a world that had been permanently changed by 3 years of mass death. The final toll was staggering beyond comprehension. Conservative estimates put the death count at 50 million people worldwide, but many historians believe the true number was closer to 100 million or even higher. In some communities, the mortality rate exceeded 50%. Entire bloodlines were wiped out, taking with them generations of accumulated knowledge, culture, and human potential. To put this in perspective, the Spanish flu killed more people in 18 months than the Black Death killed in 4 years. It killed more people than World War I, which had been the deadliest conflict in human history up to that point. It killed more people than any natural disaster, war, or famine in recorded human experience. It was, quite simply, the greatest catastrophe in the history of our species. And yet, within a few years, it had largely faded from public memory. The 1920s roared not in spite of the pandemic, but because of it people were desperate to forget, to move on, to pretend that such things couldn't happen again. The Spanish flu became a historical footnote, mentioned briefly in textbooks, and then forgotten in favor of more comfortable narratives about human progress and resilience. This collective amnesia would prove costly when future pandemics emerged, as humanity repeatedly failed to learn from its most devastating encounter with infectious disease. The lessons of 1918 about the importance of early action, international cooperation, honest communication, and robust public health infrastructure were learned and then lost again, in an endless cycle of crisis and forgetting. But for those who lived through it, who survived when so many others didn't, the Spanish flu was never really over. They carried its memory in their bones, in their reflexive fear of crowds during flu season, in their habit of stockpiling food and medicine, in their inability to ever quite believe that disaster wasn't waiting just around the corner. They were the witnesses to humanity's closest encounter with extinction, and they spent the rest of their lives trying to explain to younger generations what it was like to live through the end of the world. Most of the time, those younger generations didn't want to listen. They preferred to believe that such things belonged to the past, that medical science had advanced beyond the possibility of global catastrophe, that the systems and safeguards of modern civilization would protect them from the kind of mass death that had claimed their grandparents. They were wrong, of course. They were always going to be wrong, because the lesson of 1918 wasn't that humanity was weak or that civilization was fragile, though both of those things were true. The real lesson was that viruses don't care about human plans, human progress, or human hubris. They evolve, they spread, they kill, and they move on, leaving behind changed worlds and changed people who have to figure out how to rebuild from the ashes of everything they thought they knew. The Spanish flu wasn't just a pandemic. It was a preview of the future, a reminder that no matter how sophisticated our technology becomes, no matter how complex our social systems grow, no matter how confident we become in our ability to control the natural world, we remain just one mutation away from chaos. The virus that killed 100 million people in 1918 is still out there, still evolving, still waiting for its next opportunity to remind humanity exactly who's really in charge of this planet. And somewhere, in some laboratory or farmyard or market, the next pandemic is already beginning to take shape, learning from its predecessors' successes and failures, preparing for its own moment in the spotlight of human suffering. Because that's what viruses do. They learn, they adapt, and they survive, no matter what we throw at them. The Spanish flu taught us that lesson with 100 million lives. The question is whether we'll remember it when the next teacher arrives. The aftermath of the pandemic wasn't just about counting bodies and digging graves, though there was plenty of both. It was about trying to rebuild a world that had been fundamentally broken, not just by death, but by the knowledge of how quickly everything could fall apart. Communities that had lost half their population couldn't simply replace the missing people like broken machinery. They had lost institutional memory, cultural continuity, and the basic trust that tomorrow would be survivable. Schools reopened with teachers who had learned their trade through necessity rather than training, because the trained teachers were dead. Hospitals operated with staff who had gained their experience during the apocalypse, making life and death decisions based on trauma rather than textbooks. Governments functioned with officials who had been promoted not through competence but through the simple achievement of staying alive long enough to inherit their positions. The children who survived grew up different from any generation before them. They had seen adults powerless, institutions crumble, and death come for anyone regardless of age, virtue, or social standing. They developed a hard pragmatism that their elders found disturbing, a casual acceptance of mortality that seemed almost inhuman to people who remembered when death was supposed to be rare and meaningful. These children played games about pandemic the way previous generations had played war. They acted out scenarios of infection and quarantine with the kind of detailed knowledge that should have been impossible for their age. They hoarded food in their school desks and knew the symptoms of influenza better than most medical students. They were preparing for the next catastrophe because they had learned, in ways their parents wished they hadn't, that there would always be a next catastrophe. The economic recovery was uneven and strange. In some places, the massive reduction in population led to labor shortages that drove up wages for survivors. Entire industries had to be rebuilt from scratch because everyone who knew how to run them was dead. New opportunities opened up for people who would never have had them in the old world, simply because there was no one else left to fill the positions. But this wasn't the kind of economic opportunity that anyone wanted. It was advancement through mass death, prosperity built on graves, success that came with survivors' guilt as a permanent side effect. People found themselves wealthy not because they had earned it, but because everyone else in line had died before their turn came up. The redistribution of property was equally disturbing. Entire neighborhoods stood empty, their owners buried in mass graves or cremated in emergency pyres. Farms went unclaimed because entire families had been wiped out, leaving behind livestock that starved and crops that rotted in the fields. The legal system had to develop new procedures for handling estates when there were no heirs left to inherit them. Some people became rich by default, inheriting property from relatives they barely knew who had died without closer family. Others found themselves homeless despite having surviving family members, because the paperwork proving their relationships had been lost in the chaos, and there was no one left alive to vouch for them. The pandemic had scrambled the basic social contracts that determined who owned what and who belonged where. Religious institutions struggled with theological questions they had never had to face. How do you explain a God who allows 100 million people to die for no apparent reason? How do you provide comfort to people who have lost everything when your own faith has been shaken by the sheer scale of seemingly meaningless suffering? How do you fill churches when the pews are full of empty spaces where congregants used to sit? Some denominations embraced apocalyptic interpretations, declaring the pandemic a sign of the end times and preparing their survivors for final judgment. Others preached a more humanistic gospel, focusing on mutual aid and social reconstruction rather than divine punishment. Most struggled with declining attendance as people found it difficult to maintain faith in the face of such overwhelming evidence of human powerlessness. The pandemic had also revealed uncomfortable truths about social inequality that were hard to ignore once the crisis passed. The poor had died at higher rates not because the virus discriminated, but because poverty made everything worse. Crowded living conditions, malnutrition, inability to skip work when sick, lack of access to medical care, all the factors that made people more vulnerable to the flu were directly related to economic status. The wealthy had died too, of course. The virus was remarkably democratic in its lethality, but they had died in private homes with medical attention. While the poor died in tenements and charity hospitals, they had died with their affairs in order and their families provided for. While the poor died leaving behind dependents with no resources for survival. Even in death, class distinctions had mattered. This realization led to some social reforms in the years following the pandemic. Labor movements gained strength as workers recognized their essential role in keeping society functioning. Public health initiatives received more funding as governments realized that everyone's health was connected to everyone else's. Social safety nets were expanded, though never far enough to satisfy those who had seen what happened when they failed completely. But these reforms were limited and often temporary. The human capacity for forgetting uncomfortable truths proved as remarkable as the virus's capacity for spreading. Within a decade, many of the lessons learned during the pandemic had been abandoned in favor of more familiar patterns of exploitation and neglect. The poor were poor again. The vulnerable were vulnerable again, and the systems that had failed so catastrophically were rebuilt in essentially the same form. The medical profession emerged from the pandemic both humbled and emboldened. Humbled by their complete inability to treat or prevent the disease that had killed more people than any other cause in human history. Emboldened by the recognition that public health was a matter of national security and social stability, not just individual treatment. Medical schools began emphasizing epidemiology and public health in ways they never had before. Research into viral diseases received unprecedented funding and attention. International cooperation on health issues became a priority, as governments recognized that diseases didn't respect borders and couldn't be fought by individual nations acting alone. But the medical establishment also developed a kind of professional paranoia, a constant vigilance for the next pandemic that bordered on obsession. Every flu season brought fears that this might be the one, that the killer strain might have returned. Every report of unusual illness patterns triggered investigations and preparations for the worst-case scenario. This hypervigilance was probably necessary, but it came at a psychological cost for medical professionals who had to live with the constant awareness of how quickly everything could collapse. They became a priesthood of disaster, guardians of knowledge about humanity's vulnerability that they couldn't share without causing panic, but couldn't ignore without risking catastrophe. The generation that lived through 1918 developed their own unique culture of survival. They taught their children to always keep emergency supplies on hand, to never fully trust that good times would last, to pay attention to early warning signs of social breakdown. They passed down not just family recipes and traditions, but detailed knowledge about how to preserve food, how to recognize disease symptoms, how to organize community mutual aid networks. This survival culture created a strange split in society between those who had lived through the pandemic and those who hadn't. The survivors seemed perpetually prepared for disaster in ways that struck younger people as paranoid or obsessive. They stockpiled medicine, maintained larger gardens than they needed, and insisted on teaching skills that seemed irrelevant in peaceful, prosperous times. The younger generation found this morbid focus on catastrophe preparation to be evidence of trauma-induced neurosis. They wanted to believe in progress, in the ability of science and government to prevent such disasters from happening again. They preferred to see 1918 as a historical anomaly, a perfect storm of circumstances that couldn't be repeated in a more advanced, better prepared world. This generational divide would repeat itself throughout the 20th century, with each new cohort convinced that they had solved the problems that had destroyed their grandparents, only to discover that some problems don't stay solved. The cycle of crisis, recovery, forgetting, and renewed crisis became a permanent feature of human civilization, as predictable as the changing of the seasons. International relations were permanently altered by the pandemic experience. The war had already demonstrated that modern conflicts could involve entire populations, not just professional armies. The flu proved that threats to civilization could emerge from completely non-political sources and spread without regard for human conflict or cooperation. This led to the first serious attempts at international health cooperation. Though these efforts were limited by the same nationalism and mutual suspicion that had made the war so devastating, countries that couldn't cooperate on preventing human warfare found it equally difficult to cooperate on preventing viral warfare, even when the stakes were potentially higher. The League of Nations, formed in the aftermath of both the war and the pandemic, included health cooperation as one of its mandates, but like most international organizations, it was hampered by the reluctance of member nations to surrender sovereignty even when their individual survival might depend on collective action. The lessons of 1918 about the necessity of global cooperation were learned intellectually, but never fully implemented politically. The arts and literature that emerged from the pandemic era reflected a profound shift in how humans understood their place in the world. The confident optimism of the early 20th century, the belief in inevitable progress and human mastery over nature, had been replaced by a more complex understanding of human vulnerability and interdependence. Writers like T.S. Eliot captured this mood in works like The Waste Land, which described a world that had been spiritually and culturally devastated by forces beyond human control. The modernist movement in art and literature wasn't just a response to the war. It was a response to the broader recognition that the old certainties about civilization, progress, and human destiny had been revealed as illusions. Popular culture became simultaneously more hedonistic and more morbid, celebrating life while acknowledging its fragility. The dance crazes and jazz music of the 1920s weren't just expressions of joy. They were acts of defiance against the possibility that everything could end without warning. People danced as if their lives depended on it, because they had learned that their lives might literally depend on seizing whatever happiness was available while it lasted. The pandemic also accelerated certain technological and social changes that might otherwise have taken decades to implement. Labor shortages forced employers to accept workers they had previously excluded: women, minorities, immigrants, and some of these changes became permanent once people proved their capabilities. The crisis had broken down some traditional barriers simply through necessity. Medical technology advanced rapidly as researchers desperately sought treatments for future pandemics. While they couldn't save the victims of 1918, their work laid the groundwork for antibiotics, vaccines, and public health measures that would prove crucial in later crises. The pandemic had provided a terrible but effective education in the importance of medical research and emergency preparedness. Communication systems were also improved in response to the crisis. The pandemic had demonstrated how quickly rumors and misinformation could spread, causing panic and interfering with public health efforts. Governments and medical authorities developed better systems for disseminating accurate information quickly during emergencies, though they would discover in future crises that information control remained a persistent challenge. urban planning began to incorporate lessons learned about disease transmission and crowd control. Cities that had seen their dense populations become death traps during the pandemic invested in better sanitation, wider streets, more public parks, and improved ventilation in public buildings. The idea that urban design could be a public health measure became accepted wisdom, though implementation was often limited by cost and political priorities. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Spanish flu was psychological and cultural. It had demonstrated that human civilization, for all its achievements and complexity, remained fundamentally vulnerable to forces beyond its control. This knowledge couldn't be unknown once learned, couldn't be forgotten once experienced, couldn't be dismissed once it had killed 100 million people in 18 months. The survivors carried this knowledge with them for the rest of their lives, and they passed it down to their children in countless small ways: a tendency to worry about minor illnesses, an insistence on maintaining emergency supplies, a distrust of crowds during flu season, a deep skepticism about reassurances from authorities that everything was under control. This cultural memory of vulnerability became embedded in the collective unconscious of the 20th century, surfacing in science fiction stories about global catastrophes, in medical thrillers about pandemic diseases, in government contingency plans for various types of emergencies. The Spanish flu had taught humanity that extinction was possible, and that lesson echoed through every subsequent crisis. The irony, of course, was that this knowledge didn't prevent future pandemics from occurring. If anything, it may have made them worse by creating a false sense of preparedness. Each generation thought they had learned from 1918, thought they had developed the tools and systems necessary to prevent such a catastrophe from happening again. Each generation was partially right and catastrophically wrong. The medical advances were real but incomplete. The public health systems were improved but inadequate. The international cooperation was expanded but insufficient. The emergency plans were detailed but untested under real conditions. And underneath all the preparation and planning, the fundamental vulnerability remained unchanged. Humans were still biological organisms subject to viral evolution, still social animals dependent on contact with others, still political creatures capable of making collectively stupid decisions under pressure. So the Spanish flu stands as both a historical event and a permanent warning, a reminder that the next pandemic is always possible, and that human civilization, for all its achievements, remains just one mutation away from chaos. The 100 million who died in 1918 serve as witnesses to this truth. Their sacrifice a lesson that humanity has learned repeatedly, but never quite remembered long enough to make a permanent difference. And in the end, perhaps that's the most human thing of all: our capacity to survive disaster, rebuild from catastrophe, and then gradually forget why we needed to be prepared in the first place, setting the stage for the next crisis to catch us just as unprepared as we were the time before. The Spanish flu didn't just kill 100 million people. It revealed the cyclical nature of human memory and the eternal tension between our desire for security and our tendency toward complacency. The virus that caused it all has never really gone away. It continues to circulate in seasonal forms, continues to evolve and adapt, continues to remind us annually of its presence and its potential. Each flu season is a small-scale reenactment of 1918, a manageable version of the same basic threat that once brought civilization to its knees. Most years, we barely notice. The deaths are counted in thousands rather than millions, the disruption measured in sick days rather than societal collapse. We've learned to live with influenza as a background threat, a routine hazard like automobile accidents or heart disease, serious but manageable, dangerous but familiar. But every few decades, the virus rediscovers its pandemic potential, and humanity rediscovers its fundamental vulnerability. The cycle repeats: outbreak, panic, response, recovery, complacency, and then outbreak again. Each time we think we're better prepared than before. Each time, we're partially right and potentially catastrophically wrong. The Spanish flu of 1918 remains the standard against which all other pandemics are measured. The cautionary tale that every public health official knows by heart. The disaster that defines what's possible when human civilization meets its microscopic match. 100 million deaths in 18 months, a mortality rate that exceeded anything in recorded human history. a global catastrophe that changed the course of the 20th century and continues to shape our understanding of human vulnerability in the 21st. It's a story we tell ourselves to remember why preparedness matters, why international cooperation is essential, why public health is a matter of collective survival rather than individual choice. But it's also a story we sometimes tell ourselves to feel better about how much we've learned, how much we've improved, how much better prepared we are now than we were then. Both versions of the story are true, and both are incomplete. We have learned, and we have improved, and we are better prepared. But the fundamental challenge remains unchanged. How do you prepare for a threat that evolves faster than your defenses, spreads faster than your responses, and kills faster than your treatments can save? How do you maintain vigilance against a disaster that might not happen for years or decades, but when it does happen, could kill millions in a matter of months? The Spanish flu doesn't provide easy answers to these questions, but it does provide a definitive demonstration of what happens when we don't find answers at all. 100 million people died because humanity wasn't ready for a pandemic in 1918. The question that haunts every epidemiologist, every public health official, every government emergency planner is whether we're ready now, and whether we'll stay ready long enough to make a difference when the next test comes.